If we want user ID to work, we need to configure a few additional components to turn the feature on. And in this nugget, we're going to do exactly that. Let's begin. One of the cool benefits of using user ID is that we can associate an IP address with a user like Bob. So Bob right here is at .25. And once the user ID is all set up so that our Palo Alto firewall is actually making queries over to Active Directory, in our traffic logs, it's going to show the user involved regarding packets against the rules that are permitting or denying that traffic. And we can also set up security rules that involve users like Bob to give Bob special permissions or to deny Bob from certain types of activities or certain traffic flows. And to set it up, we're going to use an LDAP profile, which we've already done in a previous nugget in this course, which identified an LDAP server. We're also going to set up group mappings that identify which groups that we can reach via LDAP we're going to be using as part of user ID. We also need to specify credentials that our Palo Alto firewall and the integrated user ID agent are going to be using to query Active Directory to get the information regarding individual users. And then our last step is to enable user ID on the zone. And what we want to do is we want to enable the user ID on any zone where we want to identify the user associated with the source IP address. So on an internal facing zone, that would be fantastic to enable it here. But what we would want to avoid, what we would not want to do, is we would not want to enable user ID on an external facing zone out to the internet. For two reasons. There's just too many possible IP addresses out there. And secondly, we don't have the data on all the details regarding exactly who those users are. But internally, if we're using Active Directory and the security logs and making queries to our Active Directory servers, and Bob is logging into Active Directory, that's a match made in heaven. So what I would love to do is walk you through these three remaining steps of setting up our group mappings, enabling user identification, setting up the credentials to make the queries, and then enabling user ID on the inside zone. So our first step, I just want to verify that we currently have an LDAP profile set up, and we're going to click on device to go look at that. And on the left-hand side, we'll go down under server profiles, and let me collapse the tree here so we can see it. And there it is right there, LDAP. And there's our LDAP profile. So that's set up. Next, we're going to go to user identification over here on the left. So on the top, we've selected device. On the left, we're going over to user identification. And from here, we have several tabs, including user mapping as well as group mapping. And let's start over here on user mapping. So currently, it's set up to go ahead and use a security log. We can enable session monitoring if we want to. That can be helpful if somebody's logging on once to the domain and their IP address is changing. We can enable probing, and to change those options, we're going to click on this little gear right here. So we'll click on the gear to change the settings. And for the WMI, which is the Windows Management Instrumentation, we'll put in the username of administrator. So that's in NugLab, that's the domain I'm in, and the username is administrator. And again, in a production environment, you might want to create a separate user account just for this purpose, and I'll supply the administrator's password. Then as we go over to the next tab to the right, which is server monitor, we'll click that. And let's go ahead and enable session monitoring. The security log monitoring is on by default. And let's also go to client probing, and we'll enable that as well. And for our demonstration, that'll be more than enough, and we'll click on OK. Now, the next challenge is, which server should we be monitoring? So if we go down just a little bit, we'll scroll down. Here's the server monitoring section. We'll go ahead and click on Add to add a server that the integrated user ID agent on this Palo Alto firewall can go ahead and use to make those queries. So I'll call it our AD. It's Microsoft Active Directory, so we'll leave that from the dropdown. And its address is 192.168.1.111, which is reachable via the management interface on the Palo Alto firewall. So that is the IP address of my Active Directory server. And we'll click on OK. So our LDAP profile was already set up. We just set up the user identification, and let's go over to this tab called Group Mapping Settings. And we'll click on Add. We'll call this Our Group Mapping. And the server profile will select the LDAP profile that we created in the previous nugget. And then we'll go to the Group Include list, and it's going to hit the drop-down arrow here to expand this tree. And let's go to the Users container. And let's imagine the groups we want to use or include domain users and domain admins. And if we had other groups inside of Active Directory, we could select those as well. So I'm going to highlight domain admins, click on the plus symbol, highlight domain users, click on the plus symbol, and I've got a user named Bob who's a member of the domain users group. So we can use him as a test case in just a little bit when we verify this is working. So we'll click on OK, and then we'll commit this by clicking on commit, and then we'll confirm the commit. And it's at this point, if we didn't do something correctly, that we would fix it. And that's our opportunity right now. It's saying it needs to be domain/username. Didn't I do that? Let's go back. User mapping. Here's our user ID agent setup. We'll click on the gear. Ah, look at that. I put a /. Bad, Keith. All right. We'll put a \. There we go. Click OK. And then we'll go ahead and commit it. And we'll confirm the commit. And we'll make sure this goes through. Excellent. Let's close that. So next, let's go to Bob's PC. He's at .25. We'll log him into the domain. And because the Palo Alto is making queries to the Active Directory server, the Palo Alto firewall should then be able to associate Bob's IP address of .25 with the user Bob. So let's bring over Bob's computer, and there it is. And let's go ahead and log in as Bob. Oh, you know what? I'm looking at my notes right here. Check this out. So our steps were LDAP profile, group mapping, user identification, but we didn't enable user ID on the inside zone yet. So let's do that first so that we can have some success when we test it. So back to the graphical user interface we go, and we'll select the network tab. And then on the left, we'll select zones. We'll select the inside zone where we want to enable the user ID. And then we'll simply put a check in that checkbox where it says enable user identification. Click OK. We'll commit it, confirm that commit, and then once this goes through, we can then go log in as Bob and verify that it works. All right, so now at Bob's computer, let's go ahead and log on as Bob. And you'll notice here that we're logging on as Bob as part of the NugLab domain. So we've logged on. Let's also just verify for a moment that we have connectivity out to the internet. We'll put in cisco.com. Things look good. So that also should have triggered some rules on the Palo Alto firewall to allow that traffic. And as part of our traffic logs, it'll also indicate that that user associated with that traffic was Bob. So back here in the graphical user interface, let's go to Monitor, the Monitor tab. And on the left, under Logs, let's select Traffic. And we'll click on Refresh just for good measure to make sure it's refreshed. Now currently, I've removed the column for user to save space and to focus on what we were looking at previously, but now we want to see the user column. So to fix that or to add that, we'll click on the drop-down arrow from any of the columns here. And then we'll hover over columns and we'll simply add the check for source user, and that will add that back to our display. And there's our user, Bob, with a whole bunch of activity. So Bob's computer was trying to use Google, and that was met by the explicit deny at the end of our security policy. That's why it's showing here. He was using some SSL that was being caught by the rule of users going to internet. That's why it's showing here. And the cool thing is, if we click on this little magnifying glass next to an entry, which we'll do by simply clicking on this, it brings up a detailed log view which we can expand to see more of the details. And right here, it's also confirming that the source was IP address 10.1.1.25, and the user was nuglab/Bob. So we see the information shows up here in our logs, but we can also make our security policies include that criteria, the user ID, as part of permit or deny statements. So to test this, let's create a new security rule. And let's create a security rule that's looking for anybody who's a member of domain users. And if they are a member of domain users, their traffic will be dropped. So to create that security rule, under Policies, Security, we'll click on Add. And we'll call this Sorry Domain Users. And we'll click on Source, and we'll say if it's coming from anywhere, going to anywhere, for any application, for any service or URL category, the action is going to be a drop. And we're going to log at the start of session. And we're going to go over here to User. And for the user, we're going to specify we want to add anybody who's part of domain users. And we'll click on OK. Now, that's down here at the bottom, so let's go ahead and move that by grabbing it and dragging it to the top, so it's our top rule. So basically, if there's any users that are a member of that domain users group that are identified by user ID, they're going to be denied access from anywhere to anywhere. And the logs will show it, including the rule called Sorry Domain Users that killed their traffic. So we'll go ahead and commit that. We'll confirm the commit, and then let's go back to Bob's computer. So here at Bob's computer, let's go ahead and open a browser again. And let's go back to cisco.com. And it is just a huffing and puffing. See, DNS is not going to work. It can't even resolve the name anymore. So if we go, can't reach that. So if we go back to the Palo Alto and we go to Monitor, and on the left we select Traffic under Logs and then make sure it's refreshed, you'll notice we have a whole bunch of attempts by Bob, who's a member of domain users. And the rule was Sorry Domain Users that killed their traffic. As another verification, what we could do is we could create some traffic that's not associated with Active Directory at all. For example, a device that has not logged into Active Directory, And as a result, it wouldn't match domain users, and one of the other permit statements would then go ahead and allow the traffic to go through. So to do that, let's go ahead and launch GNS3 real quick. And I'll simply click on cancel. I don't care about saving this project. I just want to bring out a cloud. I'm going to bring out a switch. And let's bring out a virtual PC from the virtual PC simulator. And let's configure the cloud to go ahead and represent VMnet1, which is our internal network. So we'll add that logical interface, click OK. Now the cloud represents that. And we'll connect these together. The PC connects to the switch. Switch connects to the cloud. And we're done. And we'll start that. I'll turn off the connector tool, and I'll open up a console on virtual PC 1 by using the drop down and going to console. We'll give it an IP address of 10.1.1. Let's give it 55. Its default gateway will be 10.1.1.250, which is our Palo Alto firewall, and IP DNS will be 8888. Great. So now if we did a ping to www.google.com, so the name resolution works and the ICMP ping request worked. So now if we go back to the Palo Alto firewall and we do a refresh of our traffic logs, and let me go ahead and expand the source IP address column a little bit. Right here, with this rule, we can see the source IP address of 10.1.1.55. It couldn't determine who the user was because that little virtual PC simulator didn't log in and wasn't participating as part of Active Directory. And the ping was allowed as part of the rule called users going to internet. So what I'd also like to do is, before we close this nugget, I'd like to go back to policies and take that first rule called sorry domain users, and I'm going to disable that rule. That's so in the next nugget, when we're doing something else, all the traffic just doesn't stop. And I'm wondering, why isn't the traffic flowing? So with rule 1 disabled, we'll go ahead and commit the changes. We'll confirm the commit. And now we're back to where domain users are allowed to go out to the internet again because there's no rule denying them at the top of the list. In this nugget, we've discussed, demonstrated, and verified user ID on the Palo Alto firewall. I am glad you joined me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.